Look, we need to start somewhere, and I'm starting at the bottom. Not because Rage is incompetent, although there's probably someone arguing right now that it is, but because Stephen King himself killed this book. He let it go out of print, essentially saying, I don't want this in a world anymore. When combined with philosophical meanderings and weak writing, it's coming dead last. I read Rage this year at 35, but I can understand why someone in their teens, who's angry at the world in that unfocused way young men often are, would find it appealing. And I'll just get it out of the way right now. I don't think Rage glorifies violence, at least not directly. Charlie Decker is a high school senior, and he decides one day to shoot his algebra teacher, take his classroom hostage, and then spend the entirety of the novel justifying himself through a twisted group therapy session. It's claustrophobic, uncomfortable, and King wrote the first draft when he was 18, so he gets what it's like to be in a teenager's head. The Bachman books were King's pressure valve, the stuff his publisher, and primarily himself, thought was too raw and mean and uncomfortable for the Stephen King brand, which, yeah, is kind of crazy considering what the guy had published at this point in his career. Charlie isn't a mindless psycho, but he's articulate and funny. Darkly funny, but funny. And he's also perceptive about the hypocrisies of every adult who's failed him. He turns the hostage situation into an impromptu therapy session, forcing his classmates to confront their own buried traumas. And slowly, sickeningly, they start seeing him as a truth teller. That's the disturbing element. The Stockholm Syndrome isn't just a plot device. It's King suggesting there's something in us that wants to align with the violent outsider. That rebellion, even murderous rebellion, can feel like liberation when the alternative is suffocatingly institutional conformity. King understood, even at 18, that some monsters are most effective when they make you understand them, even as they do unforgivable things. You know, it's kind of interesting. On one hand, I think King was right to let this die. It exists in a world where school tragedies have become an epidemic, and Rage can't carry that weight. Although it was written before Columbine and this particular horror becoming routine, there's still the burden of it being found in the lockers of deeply disturbed kids. The cultural context has shifted so drastically that the book can't be separated from it anymore. But on the other hand, it's just a book. It's no more provocative than anything we see by turning on the news. In many respects, the violence in Rage has become sensationalized, and in certain circles, even lauded. Rage shows us King before he became an industry titan, and I do think it's cool to see. Even if you're not really interested in the violence, I'd still give it a read. It's pretty short, so at least you won't waste too much time if you don't like it. But yeah, Rage sits at the bottom, not because it's worthless, but because King became a significantly better writer by the time Carrie first came out. Now, would I reread it? Probably not. I'm just going to get this out of the way. I'm not the biggest fan of short fiction. I've enjoyed Philip K. Dick's short stories, but by and large, I'm just not a fan. So with that said, here's where I stand with Night Shift. When it comes to short story collections, they're greatest hits albums. And greatest hits albums are always uneven. You get the bangers, but you also get the filler tracks. Night Shift is Stephen King's first collection. It's 20 stories written mainly in the late 60s and early 70s before Carrie made him a household name. And it's good. Sometimes it's very good. But it's also the sound of a writer figuring out his range, throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, with some of it landing and some of it just falling flat on the ground. And somewhere along the lines, I must have read this, probably in high school, because when I reread it earlier this year, a lot of the stories were familiar, but in that fuzzy kind of way. I just can't remember precisely when I first read it. You know, one thing I like about the collection is that it offers a little bit of everything for every type of horror fan. You have Lovecraftian cosmic dread, body horror, domestic psychological terror, and even campfire urban legends. You have this mix because Night Shift is King's laboratory. You can see him stress testing every possible approach to fear, including different tones, structures, and subgenres. Some stories, they feel like proof of concept pieces, while others feel fully realized, like he'd been carrying them around for years, waiting to write them down. But for every The Last Rung on the Ladder, Quitters Inc., or The Boogeyman, there's a story that feels like an early draft, or a decent idea that was stretched too thin. Some of these stories are King figuring out his toolkit, not King deploying it at full power. Short stories, by their nature, can't do what King's novels do best. They can't build the elaborate architectures of dread, sustain character development, or that genuine rattle you get from being trapped in a supernatural hotel for 600 pages. Short stories, they're surgical strikes. King's great novels, they're all sieges. So yeah, Night Shift sits at number 7. I respect the craft and acknowledge the range, but I don't find many of the stories all that interesting. I first came across Carrie when I was like 15 or 16, the same age as the protagonist. And I remember being disturbed by how accurately King captured the casual cruelty of teenagers. And not just girls, boys as well. The telekinesis and the prom massacre are terrifying. But it's really that opening shower scene where Carrie experiences her first period and her classmates they pelt her with tampons, chanting "plug it up." That made this genuinely unnerving. He captured teenage bullying so damn well that it was just as relevant when I read it decades after being published. And it's interesting that the vision many of us have in our heads is one of a blood-covered Carrie wreaking havoc across Chamberlain. It's so powerful, it almost makes you forget just how amazingly well King was able to dissect the mechanics of scapegoating. And this is as much an anthropological novel as it is a horror. You know, I genuinely love Carrie, and it sucks that I'm ranking it here at number 6, but it goes to show you the absolute tear King was on in the 70s. You can see Carrie as King's Rosetta Stone for everything he'd spend the rest of his decade exploring. Every theme, obsession, and variety of institutional horror that he mastered later, it's all here in embryonic form. In grad school, I attended this symposium, and most of the students were all trying to one-up each other on abstract literature and trying to sound unique. But there was a chick who discussed Carrie and how it's really a story about what happens when power asymmetries breed violence. And you know what? All these years later, her lecture stuck with me. Carrie White possesses godlike telekinetic abilities, yet she's completely powerless. Her mother, Margaret, controls her through religious fundamentalism, weaponizing scripture to police Carrie's body and sexuality. Her classmates control her through social exclusion, turning her into a communal punching bag that reinforces their own hierarchical positions. On a certain level, King was exploring how the most dangerous monsters, they're not the ones with supernatural abilities. They're the institutions and ideologies that decide who deserves humanity. And the novel's structure is great, and honestly, I do hope that is one that he returns to in later decades. We kind of get it at the end of The Dead Zone. And it's fun to think that it could be a slight callback to him writing Carrie. It's a narrative fragmentation that bounces between news reports and scholarly analysis and survivor testimonies, and then the main story. And it almost turns Carrie's tale into an autopsy. We know from page 1 that she's dead, and Chamberlain, Maine is destroyed, and that this 16-year-old girl became a mass murderer. The suspense isn't what happens, it's how we got there. And King forces us to witness a preventative atrocity in slow motion, and then implicates everyone along the way. The bullies, the teachers who look away, the fundamentalist mother who sees sin instead of a daughter, and ultimately us as a reader. Carrie is a sociological examination of how communities manufacture their own destruction. And coming back to Carrie this year, what struck me hardest was Margaret White. She's King's first great villain, and she's terrifying because her monstrosity is it's ideological. She's genuinely believing that she's saving her daughter's soul by locking her in closets and denying her normalcy, and by treating adolescence as evidence of original sin. Her evil is the absolute certainty that comes from fundamentalist belief systems. Before he got to the inherited violence of The Shining and the ideological warfare of The Stand, King started with the most intimate of betrayals. A mother who sees her daughter as a vessel for sin, rather than just a human being. Carrie's fury at the prom isn't psychotic. It's justified. King makes you understand that the massacre is the inevitable conclusion to years of systemic abuse. He's suggesting that when you treat someone as less than human long enough, when you give them power but no outlet, when you push them past every breaking point, blood will flow. That's what makes Carrie still work nearly 50 years later. It's not about telekinesis. It's about female rage as a rational response to oppression. Guys, I get it. The Long Walk's premise sounds absurd. Dozens of people have told me as much in my comments. 100 teenage boys walk at 4 miles per hour. Drop below that pace for 30 seconds, you get a warning. 3 warnings, then you're shot dead. The last one standing wins. And I'm sure we're all thinking it at one time. How could that possibly sustain a novel? How could watching people walk be compelling enough for 300 pages? You'd be catastrophically wrong. The Long Walk is one of the most emotionally devastating books I've read by King. And the fact that he wrote it when he was just 19, that borders on obscene. By the final pages, I was genuinely shaking. And it's because King makes you care about every single one of these boys, knowing from page 1 that 99 of them die. A lot of people criticize King because his novels can be a bit bloated from time to time. But The Long Walk is King at his most disciplined. He's focused and merciless. This entire novel is just bodies failing, minds breaking, in a system that runs with mechanical efficiency. It's also King's most direct examination of American fascism without metaphor. Just a literal authoritarian state that murders children for entertainment while the population cheers. The worst part is, it's riveting. That's the sick genius of it. You can't look away. You are the problem. And by the end, The Long Walk is unbearable. And I say that in the best and most crushing way. King's character work it's just top notch here. He introduces us to dozens of walkers, and each one feels essential. King gives each boy a distinct voice, a personality, and a backstory. And then methodically, he kills them one by one across hundreds of pages, watching the number count down until only one of them remains. The cruelty of King's structure is that he makes you hope. Even though you know only one is going to survive, you fall into this false belief that your favorites might make it. When Baker starts to falter, you're desperately hoping he'll recover. And when he doesn't, when he gets his final warning, oh God, it's gutting. And then King does this 99 times. The Long Walk is obsessed with bodily autonomy and its systematic violation. The walkers, they don't control their own bodies anymore. The state dictates their pace, their rest, even their survival. Your body becomes enemy territory, one filled with blisters, cramps, exhaustion, and the biological need for sleep. Every natural human need becomes a threat to your existence. See, King at 18 was writing how authoritarian control targets the body first. You can think rebellious thoughts all you want, but if the state controls whether you eat, sleep, and survive, ideology becomes irrelevant. The walkers can hate the system, but they keep walking because the alternative is immediate death. And what's horrifying is how quickly violence normalizes. At first, every warning is terrifying. By the midpoint, warnings are routine. Boys get shot, then the survivors barely react because they're too exhausted to process grief. King shows us how atrocity becomes background noise when survival demands all of your attention. This is King writing about Vietnam, institutional violence, and what happens when the state treats young men as expendable resources. And he's doing it as a teenager with more insight than most writers achieve in a lifetime. The Long Walk is King's second Bachman novel, and it reveals impulses even darker than Rage. Where Rage explored individual alienation through a single violent act, The Long Walk examines collective complicity. This isn't one angry kid snapping. This is an entire society that normalized atrocity, systematized murder, and then convinced itself this is all entertainment. But perhaps most disturbing of all is that it's not implausible. King extrapolates things from America that already exists. Just think about it. We have military recruitment targeting poor kids with promises of education and healthcare and glory. Reality TV that humiliates for ratings. And spectator sports where we watch bodies destroy themselves all for our amusement. He just pushes it 1 degree further, removes the safety nets, and then shows us what we might become. The fact that an 18-year-old looked at America and saw this tells you everything about the darkness he was wrestling with. This wasn't adult cynicism. This was adolescent rage and despair, captured before he learned to temper it with hope. Reading The Dead Zone for the first time in 2025, it's like being trapped in a fever dream. One you can't escape from. It's haunting in its accuracy of how the political landscape calcifies into tribalism and demagoguery. It's an eerily prescient novel, not because he predicted specific events, but because he understood, with perfect clarity, how fascism markets itself in America and what it costs to stand against it. The Dead Zone is nominally about a man with precognitive powers, but it's really about the burden of knowledge, the paralysis of foresight, and the enduring question: if you could kill Hitler before he rose to power, would you? Johnny Smith is a high school teacher in Maine who gets into a car accident on his way home from a date. 4.5 years later, he wakes from a coma. His girlfriend Sarah has married someone else. His mother is this religious fanatic. And his father, his poor father, has aged a decade. And Johnny's developed psychic abilities. When he touches objects or people, he can see their past, present, or future. But King quickly points out, this isn't a gift. Every handshake is a violation. Every touch is a potential trauma. Johnny doesn't want these powers. He just wants his life back. But he's not getting it. Now that I'm thinking about it, throughout the 1970s, King was obsessed with what happens when you have power you didn't ask for, in a world that's unjust. Carrie had telekinesis and used it for revenge. Danny Torrance had the shine and then barely survived. Johnny Smith has precognition, and it destroys him piece by piece. Outside of Stilson, whom I focus on in my analysis of The Dead Zone, which, go watch it, it's a banger. I think what resonated the most with me is the relationship between Johnny and his father, Herb. Yes, I'm very biased on my own videos. I think they're all fantastic. So please, go watch them. King spent the 70s writing about parents who fail catastrophically. We had Jack Torrance, Margaret White, and Lester Billings, but it's here where he finally gives us a good father, one you can look up to. Herb Smith, he's working class and practical, and emotionally reserved in that way men of his generation were taught to be. But when Johnny wakes from the coma, Herb is there. When Johnny's life falls apart, Herb stays. When Johnny's powers make him a pariah, when the media sensationalizes him, when his girlfriend has moved on, when his mother's fears are posthumously validated, Herb never doubts him. He never questions his son. And most importantly, he never abandons him. Their scenes together they're quiet, they're understated, and some of the most tender writing King produced in the entire decade. There's a moment, Johnny and Herb, they're sitting in silence after a particularly brutal day, just being together in shared grief. And it wrecked me. It made me think of my own dad and how much I miss him. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. But here's the thing. King doesn't sentimentalize it. Herb doesn't give a speech about unconditional love. He's just present. And sometimes that's everything you need. The novel's true power, and the reason it's ranked this high, comes from Greg Stilson and King's understanding of populist fascism. Now, stop me if you've heard this one before. An out-of-nowhere candidate making a political run. He just happens to be vulgar, while appealing directly to working-class anger and resentment. He wears a hat to rallies with his name on it. He speaks in simple slogans. He positions himself as a man of the people against corrupt elites. He's authentic in the way demagogues are authentic. Performatively, strategically, and effectively. But he's also a sociopath. He built his political operation through intimidation and violence. He has no ideology beyond his own power. But none of that matters, because he performs authenticity in a way that resonates with voters who feel abandoned by traditional politics. This was 1979. And King was writing about Huey Long from the 30s, and Joe McCarthy from the 50s, and George Wallace in the 60s. Yet, lo and behold, decades later, we get reality TV presidents and drain the swamp chants and populist strongmen. He was writing before social media turned politics into performance art. King showed us exactly how democracy dismantles itself through voluntary surrender to charismatic authoritarians. What's brilliant about King's construction of Stilson is that he doesn't make him cartoonishly evil. To his supporters, Stilson is genuinely charismatic. People love him, and it's because they're desperate for someone who speaks their language, who validates their anger, and who promises simple solutions to complex problems. King understands that fascism doesn't always announce itself with skulls and swastikas. Sometimes it shows up in a hard hat, shaking hands, and making you feel seen. Dread. That's the word I think of when I think about Salem's Lot. It's the creeping realization that an entire town was being consumed. House by house, family by family. And nobody noticed until it was too late. Once you get past the superficial horror of vampires, you see that this is really a novel about how easily a community cannibalizes itself. This is where King announced himself as more than a promising debut author. If Carrie showed potential, Salem's Lot delivered on it completely. He's not just telling a scary story, he's building an entire ecosystem and then watching it collapse from within. I kind of wish I read this one as a kid, because I think I would have been absolutely terrified by Kurt Barlow. Structurally, the lot is nearly flawless. King spends the first third of the novel just introducing us to Jerusalem's lot. Characters who seem inconsequential, they become pillars of the narrative. Most writers would have rushed to the vampires. But I love that Salem's Lot it's essentially telling you that you can't mourn a community unless you first know it. So he makes you care about these people, including their petty resentments, their secret shames, and the small kindnesses. And then he destroys them. That patience and willingness to invest in the mundane before unleashing the supernatural, that's craft and confidence. That's a writer who knows exactly what he's doing, and it shows in the town structure and the economic predation it faces when Barlow comes. The Marston house sits on the hill above town like a Gothic mansion transplanted from an 18th or 19th century novel. But King puts it in 1970s small town Maine. Jerusalem's Lot is a community already hollowed out by economic decline and the slow death of post-war American prosperity. When Barlow arrives, he doesn't even have to invade. He just buys his way in. He buys the house and establishes a business and integrates into the commercial fabric. Watching the vampirism and watching it spread is one of my favorite parts of the novel. Mike Ryerson is turned while doing his job as a gravedigger. The Glick boys are turned through childhood friendship, and Susan Norton through romantic connection. And King maps the vampire plague onto the very social bonds that hold communities together, revealing them as vectors of consumption. Your neighbor becomes predator, your friend becomes parasite, and the institutions meant to protect you, they're either corrupted or powerless. This is Bram Stoker's Dracula for American 1970s. And it's absolutely brilliant. Just think about how the vampire isn't an external threat. The rot was already there, deep inside the town and its residents. Barlow just accelerated the inevitable. At 35 years old, you know the scene that frightened the hell out of me? Danny Glick floating outside of Mark Petrie's window, asking to be let in. It's, just poking on the window. You can hear the sound of the window, the clicking or clacking. It's terrifying. It weaponizes nostalgia. Danny looks exactly as he did in life, promising friendship and using the coded language of childhood bonds. Mark's terror isn't just about the monster at his window. It's about recognizing that his friend is gone and something else is wearing his face. It's so creepy. And that's the horror of Salem's Lot. It's the familiar made predatory. King's vampires are feral. They're predators and parasites. There's no seduction or tortured mortal angst. There's just hunger and the methodical extermination of a community. I don't think there's enough said about the character work in Salem's Lot. From Ben Mears chasing his childhood trauma and exorcising his demons, to Father Callahan already losing his faith, self-medicating with alcohol, and going through spiritual motions for a congregation that doesn't believe anymore. It's great writing, just all around, full circle. I mean, that scene where Father Callahan faces Barlow and the chills that run up and down your body, and when you realize his faith has failed him. That might be the defining scene for me out of King's entire 70s run. It's hard to pick. There are so many great books, including the ones I've already mentioned and the ones I've yet to mention. But that scene and Father Callahan, holding up the cross in front of Barlow and his faith faltering is just so good. Now, I've gone back and forth over where Salem's Lot should fit on this list. Initially, I had it as number 1. It could have easily been number 1 if it wasn't for that damn thing called nostalgia. I read The Shining for the first time when I was in my late teens. And all these years later, I never forgot it. When I got to room 217 with the woman in the tub, I put the book down, I ran around the house, and turned every single light on. I'd be damned if I was going to fall victim to that creepy ass old lady. Hell no. Absolutely not. When I reread it last year at 34, I was still looking over my shoulder. That chapter still works, and the crazy thing is, it's only part of what makes The Shining so terrifying. Because now that I'm an adult, and I've lived through a youth spent under the roof of an alcoholic, it's really Jack Torrance that gets to me. He reminds me of my own childhood. King isn't just writing about the supernatural. He's writing in the vein of a psychologist, a sociologist, and a chronicler of the violence we inherit and can't escape. If Carrie is the first examination of inherited violence, then The Shining is where King mastered it. And I don't use that word loosely either. This is just a true masterclass in the ways abuse becomes legacy, passed down like genetic code, wearing down resistance until the cycle repeats. It's the type of writing that made me reflect, and it made me cry. Now, I'm not the most well-read of constant readers, but I've made it through 18 books so far. So I'm not exactly new either. This is the most psychologically devastating novel King has written. Now, come back to me after our first child is born next year, I'll probably have a different answer. The Shining operates on multiple registers simultaneously. On the surface, we have a haunted hotel. Deeper, a monument to American capitalism's blood-soaked history. Then there's a father's disintegration and a son's trauma. All of it playing out in isolation where there's nowhere to run and no one to save you. You can tell from the beginning that King structures this novel as a countdown to the inevitable moment when Jack's control is going to shatter. And King was battling his own alcoholism when he wrote this. And he gives us a man who loves his son, who's trying desperately to be better, but he's losing. You watch him rationalize and justify. You watch him construct elaborate mental gymnastics to explain why his rage is discipline, why his resentment is justified, and why his family is the problem. The Overlook, it doesn't have to possess Jack. It just reveals him for the man he is. And that's the brilliant part of the novel. The Overlook Hotel is King's most iconic setting because it works as a literal haunted house and as a metaphor for everything toxic in American history. King uses the hotel's predatory structure as an externalization of Jack's psychology. The ghosts aren't necessarily invading Jack's mind. Instead, they're giving voice to his thoughts. Lloyd the bartender is Jack's alcoholism personified. The woman in 217 is his guilt and self-loathing made flesh. Grady, the former caretaker who murdered his family, is the dark permission Jack is seeking. The Overlook is a mirror, and what it reflects back is Jack's inheritance. It's his father's abuse and rage, and the violence passed down that he swore he'd never repeat. The hotel just removes the pretense that he could ever escape it. The first time I read The Stand, I was burned out on reading. You know, like, high school, it has a funny way of doing that to kids. But then my English teacher, Mr. Simmons, shout out to Mr. Simmons, he handed me a mass market copy of the book. It was like this thick, and it was daunting as hell, no doubt about it. But over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, I fell in love with reading again. I still remember that early scene after the super flu had just been released, and Campion crashes into Hapscom's gas station, and realizing this is it. This is the destruction of America right in front of us. Captain Trips is here to stay. Then you get this epic about the end of the world that somehow feels intimate and personal. Before I go any further, I gotta give a shout out to what is probably my favorite chapter in all of literature, No Great Loss. I said earlier that Father Callahan's failure of faith is the defining scene of King's 70s. Well, No Great Loss is that, but for an entire chapter. One by one, these people we've never met, they're dying. And King makes you, every death matters. You read it and you think, how is he doing this? How is he making me mourn strangers? I don't even know how else to phrase it. It's such a genius chapter. And it was one that Joe Abercrombie ended up emulating in his book, The Heroes. And unsurprisingly, it's the best chapter of the book. I love that chapter. Above all of the other novels, why did The Stand take first? I think it's because it's King's most complete vision of America. We have its violence, its potential, its failures, and even our stubborn hope. And it's also the most ambitious novel of his career, juggling dozens of major characters across thousands of pages, building towards a confrontation that asks fundamental questions about human nature and free will, and whether we're capable of learning from our mistakes. This is King's attempt to write an American Lord of the Rings, a mythic battle between good and evil, set against the collapse of civilization. But instead of Middle Earth, it's contemporary America. Instead of orcs and wizards, it's a weaponized superflu and the survivors who must rebuild. And instead of a clear moral universe, it's messy and complicated. The first act is purely apocalyptic horror. Captain Trips is essentially weaponized influenza with a 99% mortality rate. When it escapes a military facility and spreads across the country in days, King doesn't flinch from the logistics of extinction. He shows us infrastructure collapsing, with hospitals overwhelmed and governments disintegrating, supply chains breaking, and bodies piling up in streets. What's interesting now, as we live in a post-COVID world, is how accurately King predicted human response to pandemic. He got everything from the denial to the rumors and the desperate hope that it's not as bad as it seems. He even nailed how certain institutions lie to prevent panic, which only makes the panic worse when the truth becomes undeniable. Reading this during an actual pandemic, it was eerie. But The Stand isn't interested in apocalypse as spectacle. It's interested in apocalypse as moral reset. King kills off 99% of humanity, and then asks, what happens to the survivors? What kind of society do they build? Do they repeat the mistakes of the old world, or try to build something new? This is where the novel becomes mythic. Survivors begin having dreams, with some dreaming of Mother Abigail, a 108-year-old woman in Nebraska who represents faith and community and spiritual grace. And then others dream of Randall Flagg, who promises power and violence and the freedom to indulge every dark impulse. When it comes to Flagg, he's one of my favorite villains in fiction. His presence and aura, he's so charismatic. You know, I hate to say it, but I can see why people fall for his lure and charm. He also has some fantastic nicknames throughout the course of the novel. You know, we get the Walking Dude, the Dark Man, the Man with No Face, the Ageless Stranger. That's one of my favorites. and the Midnight Rambler. But he's also referred to as other supernatural and mythic aliases. He's called Beelzebub and Legion, Ahaz, Astaroth, and Anubis. So the entire time you're reading The Stand and being introduced to Flag, his presence is swirling in this sort of mysterious and malevolent nature. It serves to connect him to ancient evil and cosmic horror. He's such an enduring presence that he's lived with me for over 20 years, implanted in my brain and in my heart. Can't say that for too many other characters, regardless of medium. Why does The Stand beat The Shining and Salem's Lot? The Shining, honestly, I do feel like it's a more perfect novel in terms of craft and execution. Every element works. The prose is tighter, the structure is more elegant, but The Stand is more ambitious. It's King taking bigger risks, reaching for something beyond horror. He's trying to write American mythology, understanding the country's soul, and ultimately answering whether humanity deserves salvation. Yeah, the Stand is messier. Some subplots don't fully pay off, and the pacing sags during the Boulder Free Zone sections. Yeah, the ending is also divisive, but those imperfections are the cost of ambition. King is swinging for the fences here, attempting something so huge that perfect execution was just, it was impossible. And honestly, the ambition matters more. The Shining is King mastering what he already knew how to do. The Stand is attempting something he'd never done before, and mostly succeeding. And that to me it's more interesting. Every time I finish The Stand, I don't want it to end. Despite its length, I want to stay with these characters longer. And that's the mark of a masterpiece. It's not just that it's ambitious or well executed, but that it creates a world so fully realized, you mourn leaving it. The Stand is King's most complete statement about America in the 70s. It's a novel that believes humanity is worth saving, even as it catalogs all the reasons we might not be. It's not just King writing horror or science fiction or even fantasy. He's crafting mythology and philosophy, and doing it all while holding a mirror up to everything we are and everything we fear becoming.